Welcome everybody to today's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Grand Rounds. Continuing Education Code for EADS is 17 Tough. Topic of today's Grand Rounds is neurobiological lessons learned from clinical practice. Dr. Gaskill has worked in community mental health for over 46 years with Sumner County Mental Health in Wellington, Kansas. He is a licensed clinical psychotherapist and a mental health counselor, registered play therapist and supervisor, and an endorsed infant mental health clinical mentor. He is a founding member and past president of the Kansas Play Therapy Association and is currently a board member of the Association for Play Therapy. He has published numerous book chapters and magazine articles with Dr. Bruce Perry of the Child Trauma Academy and lectured throughout the United States. Dr. Gaskill has lectured at Wichita State University Approved Play Therapy Center, teaching play therapy and supervising play therapy practicum students for the past 26 years. Dr. Gaskill does not have any relevant commercial financial arrangements related to the content of the presentation today. Residents, there is an after session with Dr. Gaskill today. So please join me in giving me a warm welcome to Dr. Gaskill.
Good morning. Will you, do I pull up my slides or do you have them at this point or?
I do not have them if you'd like to share them.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's fine. I will do that. See if this works. Yeah, okay. Can you all see those? Hopefully. Let me give you just a quick background as to where this particular program came from. And you see down at the bottom that it has my name and Jean Brown. Jean Brown is the clinical director at Sumner County Mental Health Center, and she and I developed this program about a year ago, and and it is part of the advanced clinical series for the TASN, or the Technical Assistance Systems Network, for the Department of Education for Kansas in our school mental health collaborative initiative. This is also going to be, or has been proposed to be, the subject matter for a magazine article in the Play Therapy magazine. The reason that I decided to present this today is, oh golly, going back to when I was in a graduate school and just starting my clinical practice, I talked with many primary care physicians. And one of the things that they told me consistently was that 70 to 80% of the work that they did as primary care physicians often included psychiatry, that the family doctor is often the first and sometimes the only contact that many people have with seeking care for their mental health issues. And having participated with Dr. Brown there at the KU Med Center with the telepsychiatry and consultation program with the Children's Initiative in the state of Kansas, it's abundantly clear that many times people who have specialties other than psychiatry end up having to handle some of these programs. So what I thought was I would go through 10 of the things that I think neuroscience has consistently pointed out being important in our clinical practice. Now, down at the bottom of the title, you see relational, relevant, rhythmic, repetitive, rewarding, and respectful. Those are the 6 R's that Dr. Perry talks about a lot. And I have, as I've gone through these particular issues, I've noted which of his 6 R's I think we're actually talking about. My hope is that as physicians, as primary care people of one type or another, and understand there are some social workers and maybe some psychologists on here, is when you're thinking about or referring a family for treatment, there are some things that I think we're learning that we need to pay attention to. so that we have maybe a better idea on how to support the family, the child, the community in working with this particular child. So that's kind of what I'm hoping I can give you some ideas to think about in that regard. Okay, I'm having trouble advancing my slides. There we go. All right. So what we have are a number of treatment misconceptions, and I've done another workshop where I talk about this. I just did this at the International Play Therapy Conference, that most of our mental health information evolved in a time before we knew much about the human brain. And because of that, and because of the difficulty in measuring things like affects, emotions, those kinds of experiences, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, we made a huge movement into looking at conscious, logical, cognitive, intentional, verbal, insightful, expressive kinds of treatments. And while those have yielded very definite benefits, and the research on them is on cognitive treatments is quite good, there are many brain areas that are beyond the reach of cognitive-based methods. And so there is a growing movement and related to the ability to research these other areas of the brain which are non-cognitive. And I would refer you down here to, I've got a list of names if you have interest, that this program is based heavily on the works of Perry, Kennebaugh, Bluestein, Spinoza, and a gentleman, Rousseau from Australia, and Van der Kolk from formerly of the Harvard Medical School. And the research is coming out, Dr. Perry told me, at the rate of about 2,000 neuroscience articles a year relating to human behavior and neuroscience. So the current research is suggesting that access to specific brain regions through input modalities unique to that brain region is critical to our treatment plan. So it looks like several things are happening. One is we're validating a lot of the things that we've done historically, even going back to Carl Jung and Freud. And I just did at the last International Play Therapy Conference, I did a workshop where a Jungian play therapist talked about the Jungian play therapy strategies, and I explained them in terms of neurobiological principles. So there's a lot of support for things that we've done, but it also is helping us improve the quality of what we do by knowing based on symptomatology, which areas of the brain should be targeted. So in a general sense, all sensory stimuli enters the low brain first, and it is processed, integrated, and responded to before higher centers are aware of that input. And actually, some sensory input is never processed cortically. So a fellow by the name of Jacques Panksepp, in his book in 2012, talks a lot about low brain processes. In fact, Jacques Panksepp is the first person to map the 7 neural networks in the low brain, and he talks about the fact that these networks operate unconsciously, they're nonverbal, and they're irrational. So they don't fit well into a lot of our historic treatment plans. They tend to be much more associative, automatic, and are not subject to cortical control in terms of being able to manage, control those low impulses. And I put over there in parentheses, one of the things you need to maybe use as a memory aid about these low brain circuits is that they work very much like an on-off switch, or sometimes it's like a thermostat. They're either on or they're off. All of these have at their core either life support or survival value, and that is the primary focus of these low brain circuits. Panksepp calls them our ancestral voices, and they are written into our DNA, and they urge the human being or mammals generally into action in order to perpetuate life, sustain life, or other forms of very primitive survival. So with traumatized children, these pathways are often altered or disorganized as a result of the neglectful, abusive experiences that they've had. And so I've said enough at this point. I hope that you understand that these circuits are altered and disorganized, if you will, but they don't respond always to our traditional treatment modalities. So the 7 primary emotional systems are listed here with the positive affects of seeking, expecting, caring, nurturing, joy, social lust, social joy. The negative are fear, anxiety, panic, sadness, rage. Now, those circuits are not connected to the cortical functioning at birth, but they become innervated in the cortex later in life as part of our developmental process. And that occurs primarily, we now know, through sleep and play. Now, there's ample evidence to suggest that primary process emotions do not require the cortex. And I was fascinated a while back to read that decorticated rat studies and human babies who are born without a cortex validate the fact that these primary circuits continue to function whether we have a cortex or not. So trauma creates very overactive, overly sensitive primary neural systems that often bypass cortical modulation functions. Now, put in simple terms, this is one of the reasons that most of us who have worked with adults who have had early life trauma will connect with something that I have heard many times over the years, and that is, I understand completely why I react the way I do. I just can't stop it from happening. And that's because the cortex understands the educational, intellectual information, but the low brain has not changed. So it continues to send those same signals. So the first consideration in working with people, particularly those I'm focusing on here with what we call developmental trauma, or in other words, the traumatic experiences have occurred with these children during the time that their brain was developing and growing, and it's caused the brain, if you will, to be wired in an inappropriate way, particularly in these low brain areas. So just a couple of caveats that have a lot to do with treatment, and that is that the sequence and process of creating new and more functional neural connections is the main focus of therapy. So treatment then has to be a progressive or a progression of developmentally hierarchical, relational, and emotional experiences, and that they become encoded in the brain. So we cannot undo the old connections. What we're trying to do is create new connections. This is also why many people who have suffered developmental trauma will tell you that the old memories and the old ways of behaving are not gone, but they have stronger and better methods of managing them. And that is often the result of positive experiences in therapy. So treatment then must replicate this normal developmental sequence beginning in the lowest disorganized brain region. So treatment for children who have had, or adults who have had developmental trauma, often is what they call a bottom-up process. So how do I know where to start or what to do? One of the first clues down here at the bottom is, I said, if you can match the age when the trauma occurred or began with the onset of the symptoms, it will often give you an idea of which brain regions were particularly organized, disorganized, and at what age that occurred. This is a slide that Dr. Perry uses a lot. I can't give that to you, but if you will go to the internet and just Google Perry slides, they're all over the internet, and you can download various versions of this. But just very quickly to look over this, we know that the brainstem most actively organizes in utero and in the first year of life, and it controls life support systems, metabolism, temperature, respiration, just all the things that you have to have functioning in order to be viable outside the womb. Attention, focusing, tracking, impulsivities, primary sensory awareness, and the value of those impulses are all part of the functioning of the low brain. So lots of autonomic nervous systems or functions like asthma, diabetes, immune system. You'll see a lot of people who have early developmental trauma at the brain stem region will have those kinds of symptoms. So looking at the collective health of the person, not only their psychiatric, but also their medical health, can often help you zero in on which of these areas was affected first. The next area, the diencephalon and the cerebellum, these are most actively developed during the first to the second year of life. And these are survival drives, motor regulation, sleep regulation. Sleep regulation issues are a classic symptom in psychiatric patients. Feeding, appetite, thirst, sex drive, the primary survival drives to procreate, to perpetuate, to stay alive. And if you think about the number of people who have sleep dysregulation, hunger, thirst, sex drive, arousal problems, the diencephalon is involved in an awful lot of our psychiatric symptomatology. Coordination, balance, fine and gross motor, all of those are mediated through these low areas. In the 25 years that I was the clinical coordinator for the therapeutic preschool in Sumner County, one of the things we saw with 3 to 5 year olds who are having severe emotional problems were often the dysregulation in these areas. And I used to watch the kids on the playground a lot to get an idea of their motor coordination. And sure enough, frequently that was problematic. They were a little behind there compared to their age mates. The limbic system, most actively developing between the first and fourth year. And so it's interesting to me that the development of the brain is into the third of the 4 major divisions that are frequently talked about by the time you get to preschool. So now we're talking about social, interpersonal, behavioral kinds of activities, reward systems, the ability to learn, to transfer short-term memory into long-term memory occurs in this area. So affiliation, sharing, relational kinds of activities, attachment, attunement with others, mood, affect, verbal and nonverbal cues, reading those, short-term memory, working memory, all of these are happening in this area. So obviously trauma occurring in the preschool years and before can be very, very damaging to a number of these neural systems that we need to have well organized. Finally, in the cortex, neocortex, all of our complicated cognitive functions that make us, sometimes I think of, and have heard others speak as most human. These are most rapidly developing in the second year of life through the teens, but also continue to mature into the late 20s and early 30s. So abstract thinking, sense of time, self-awareness, self-image, language, expressive, receptive, articulation of language, self-reflection, insight, morality, spirituality. Those things become possible only when the final segment of the brain development begins to take place. One of the things I will also tell you, just as a sidebar, I think I mentioned it somewhere later in here, but the Piaget and developmental functions now are tied directly to brain growth and maturation in various parts of the brain. And if you're curious, if you will Google brain scans and Piaget, you can pull up brain scans which are very interesting to look at. And you can very clearly see that the brain development for Piaget and functions are definitely related to brain organization. Normally, I spend about an hour on this part, but that's just a real quick overview of hopefully a lot of things that you have learned in more detail other places. But it looks to me like, and I've spent the last 20 plus years advocating that mental health personnel need to learn more about the brain, because what we do and how we do it increasingly has been shown to change the way the brain organization transpires. So here we have consideration number 2, functional age. You'll find a lot of the things that I'm talking about tend to overlap, but I try to break them out into 10 discrete things that we're talking about, just so I can make sure I say some things that I think are very pertinent to this. So development is a neurological progression of connecting and maturing of neurons. It really is not an act of will. For those of you who are working with parents, this is probably one of the most fundamental things that I try to get across to parents, because, oh gosh, even if I quote my own mother, when I was growing up, I remember hearing her believe that a big part of parenting was breaking the child's will, and that was a socialization process. When the reality is, it is nurturing and supporting and scaffolding neural growth. So the hierarchical sequence of mastery of lower skills has to precede the higher development of upper brain skills. So each stage is foundational for the following stage. That's the definition of hierarchical. Chronological age, or the actual age, generally offers kind of a global estimate of neuronal maturity. So it is not an adequate guide for maltreated children to use chronological age. Instead, we need to focus more on functional age. Maltreated children are commonly known to have delays in one or more developmental domains. So we will often see with seriously emotionally disturbed children what's been referred to as a broken ability pattern. And I tried to make a rough sketch for you there over on the right of a broken ability pattern, where normal is between those two areas, but we'll see things that are outside the range of normal. And when I talk about developmental domains, please remember that's not just intellectual development, it's an intellectual, cognitive development, social development, relational development, physical development, and I'm leaving one off. I mention them later, but it's every domain. One of the biggest mistakes that I find mental health people making is that they will think that the development is only in social and emotional growth. And sometimes they'll throw in intellectual. But when we assess these kids, we need to look at each of the domains. So the functional age is the current degree of neuronal maturity and organization capacity and the general functionality of the child's brain. So if we don't follow a design and design interventions that are consistent with these, it is a critical or a fatal error to copy the world of computer science. So we've got to take those into account. So treatment is generally going to begin at the child's functional age and move forward based on success and mastery. Or in other words, to put that in neurological language, as we create healthy neurological organization and connections. So treatment needs to begin at the last successful stage, regardless of age. And developmental surveys may be helpful in some ways in getting an idea, although one of the things that I found is that if you look at the child's behavior, a lot of times people who are around kids a lot will say, gosh, he acts like he's a 4-year-old or whatever. And I found that teachers are amazingly accurate, even when they don't realize that they're giving diagnostic information. They're often very, very accurate about the child's functional age. And failure to follow or to sequence treatment based on the functional age is going to either weaken or negate the impact of what we're doing. And the reason for that is that the brain functions in a hierarchical fashion. Lower areas have to organize before they can appropriately inform upper areas. And that's something that has not always been a well understood treatment caveat by therapists. So we've got to stimulate the underdeveloped capacities by providing rewarding, rich, relational, supportive experiences. Treatment is going to be successful or it's going to fail depending on the ability to create a relationally rich environment. And the research just continuously says that that is important. In fact, there's research now coming out that suggests that that's actually more important than the treatment modality. Each brain region responds to its own unique language. All 4 of those brain domains we looked at do not respond to spoken language. So we've got to make sure that we are communicating with the brain regions that we want to change in the language or the communication system that they were genetically programmed to use. There are lots and lots of scaffolding or building supports around a child so that they will be successful. The famous play therapist, Gary Landreth from the University of North Texas, talks about this, and he says, you never want to do something for a child that the child can do for themselves. And he said, even if I have to supply 99% of the support to make something happen, if the child has put in 1%, then the child is successful. And that the normal developmental sequence, and if you think about training your child to ride a bicycle or to walk or all of the developmental milestones, often you supported those in some way so that the child could experience success with support. A lot of working with these kids is about that scaffolding process and providing whatever level of support it is so that they can learn. And then we withdraw the scaffolding gradually as they become more and more competent. I guess that's, as I think about it, that's also what we did with our kids when they were learning to drive. Made me nervous as all get out, but we drove around in school parking lots and before we drove on streets. And so there is a progression. But no matter how much delay there is in the child's development, whether it's social, emotional, cognitive, physical, and motor, there are the five, and I apologize for blanking on that a little earlier. We all have the same needs, and those needs are for positive supports, positive scaffolding, and positive expectations from adults. And I think often primary care doctors are frequently put in a very awkward position because the child is presented as the problem and there's something wrong, where there may actually be something wrong in the child's social emotional environment. So building cortical modulation capacity, which is translated into the gradual integration of the inhibitory control of the cortex into the lower brain, which happens over time through positive experiences. That is where we begin to gain some ability to manage those low brain impulses. Failure to take these variables into account obviously are going to result in various degrees of treatment failure. So I'm just showing you this to throw out the idea here. If you look over under cognitive functions, it gives you some of the things that the child is capable of and how they receive information. Also, the adult to child ratio is there. And I will tell you that these ratios are probably a little bit too high for any child other than a very normally functioning child. We'll talk about this later in more detail, but the reality is that children have a much greater need for individual attention as they deal with social emotional problems. So moving to the third consideration, the treatment modality. What modality are we going to pick? Now, obviously, we want to follow this bottom-up kind of rubric that I've introduced. So we have to give some thought to how will this treatment modality impact the disorganized lower brain region or the particular brain region that we're trying to focus on. So symptoms, whether they're physical, emotional, social, behavioral, or cognitive, are all cues and suggestive of the disorganization at specific brain regions, because we know those four basic regions that I laid out are the primary mediator of various of the various functions. So again, we begin at the lowest disorganized region and focusing on the child's functional age. The activities must follow the normal sequence of development because of what I've already said about higher regions are dependent on the organization and synthesis of information at lower regions. The higher levels cannot function properly until the lower levels function normally. And this has always reminded me of one of the things I learned in the very first computer science class I took in college, and they talked about garbage in equals garbage out. So if we don't input the right information and correct information into each of these brain regions, then we shouldn't be surprised if that region comes up with faulty ideas about what the brain should, or what the human being should be doing. So all treatments do not impact all brain regions equally or at all. And it says topic of next session. In the series that we were doing for TASN, we did 3 2-hour sessions, and the second session dealt totally with that. So the first diagnostic questions we have to ask ourselves is, what actually is going on in the brain? And there are 3 general possibilities. And these 3 I take from a friend of mine, Paul Levy, who is a neuropsychologist in California, and this is how he breaks it down. And that is, and Bruce Perry does the same thing, but in a little bit different language. So are the neural structures organized and intact? Or in other words, do we have a healthy brain, but we've just had insufficient stimulation? If that's the case, the kids progress very, very rapidly because the wiring is intact. The second is that neural structures are present, but they're disorganized. Or in other words, there's been some aberrant experiences that have caused the neural connections to be connected in a way that is not entirely helpful and maybe even counterproductive. And then the last one is neural structures are physically damaged and not present, or not present. And in that case, we now are trying to teach a child something in ways other than they would normally learn them. And this, we can obviously understand that there is an increasing degree of difficulty with that in the neuropsychological training I have had, which is fairly minimal, about a 1 3-hour credit class in graduate school. One of the things they talked about there is that when you are not able to make the neural connections that you need to, then you have to reroute and go around. And I always liken that to physical therapy with people who have had these very same varying levels of disorganization. And if the structures responsible for being able to stand and walk are not there, then I may have to find some alternate ways for that to happen. And obviously, that's where we begin to get into very, very long and laborious physical therapies and physical aids to people so that they can function. But those are the same ones that we are talking about in mental health in terms of the degree of disorganization. So your options change, obviously, as I've indicated, dramatically based on each of those conditions. Now, one of the things that Dr. Perry says, because when I talk about this with my graduate students at Wichita State, it's not uncommon for them to get depressed and say, gosh, this doesn't really sound hopeful. One of the things that Dr. Perry says that I think we want to remember is everybody can get better. Now, you may or may not be able to regain the functional capacity that you once had or the potential that you had, but everybody gets better. So the typical treatment progression here is regulate, relate, and reason. So the first thing that we've got to do in this bottom-up idea is that we have to get the child to calm, to establish some sense of homeostasis, safety, regulatory stability. So before we move to more complicated kinds of therapies, we've got to work on them regulating. So the treatment modality needs to be supportive of that. And then after that, then the attuned relational interactions to build empathy, understanding relational needs. Those things become the focus. And then finally, reason, using cognitive abilities to understand, solve, plan, those kinds of things. So down here, I have a caveat. We want to remember that cortical interventions that are logical and reasoned are largely thwarted by deprivation and survival reactions in the low brain. So the first thing you're going to take care of are those survival reactions in the low brain. And until we can get the person to feel safe, then that's going to be the primary focus of the person. Just as a quick jump into the language by brain region, the brainstem responds primarily to soothing somatosensory experiences. It is unconscious and unresponsive to spoken word. The language, it does respond to tone, rhythm, volume, sensory experience, eye contact, face-to-face gaze, calming, pacifying kinds of behaviors, rhythm, pattern, sensory experience. Those are all soothing to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal complex. Generally, these things are things that occur in modalities with 60 to 80 beats per minute, which is heart rate, which maybe isn't too surprising since the baby has been in utero for 9 months and does imprint the mother's heart rate and will recognize the child's heart rate from other heart rates at birth. The diencephalon, sensory movement, still unconscious, unresponsive to language. Controlled, enjoyable, proprioceptive movement, fine gross motor movements that are patterned, repetitive, and rhythmic, like walking, swinging, music, narrative, storytelling, dance, stretching, yoga, things that create safe, predictable sequences of routines, still at 60 to 80 beats a minute. So lots of our physical therapy activities probably fit into these, as do maybe arts and crafts that emphasize these. Now, I'm not saying that we don't talk to the people in that process. We do, but you've got to remember it's these activities that are carrying the therapeutic message. And if you spend too much time in the higher cortical areas, you will actually deter the lower areas from making the progress that they need to make. The limbic part of the brain consciously responding to language, especially emotional, verbal, nonverbal cues in human interactions, the emotional latency of the conversation, social experiences. Traditional play therapy actually fits here. Parallel play, natural discovery, dance, movement, art expression, social and relational experiences, shared experiences, attachment. One of the things, and I am fearful I'm probably going to run out of time here, but I'm going to say it while I'm thinking about it anyway. Bessel van der Kolk in 1996 did a research study where he compared psychiatric medication with primary talk therapy and yoga. And yoga initially was more powerful than the other three in relieving symptomatic behavior of people, which I find very, very interesting. And that does follow this sequence. Not that the others aren't helpful, but much of the trauma symptomatology is coming out of the low brain. And then finally, cognitive concepts, abstraction, understanding, impulse control, sequencing, language, all kinds of things here are possible. Unfortunately, most of our therapies historically have been designed for the limbic brain and the cortex. And that's largely because we didn't understand the functioning of the low brain, and that wasn't really well understood. There were plenty of people who theorized about it, but it wasn't really understood from a medical scientific perspective until the very late 90s and the early 2000s. Dr. Perry told me that there are 2,000 articles a year being written about the material that I'm talking to you about, and it has become almost impossible for a person, a neuroscientist, to be up on their own field. So the consideration of dosing, repetition, and frequency, or how often do we need to do these? It depends on the brain level, and the upper brain regions can improve very, very rapidly. But the lower brain regions, which are much more actively growing, developing, and organizing early in life, and then do it in a much slower way later, may take thousands of repetitions. But having said that, one of the things I want to point out is you want to remember that a single dose or repetition can be as simple as a smile. So in the course of working with someone for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever the therapy session is, there can be many, many, many activities that actually are helpful. The one thing this does get to, though, is the more of the child's environment that are participating in the healthy dosing or repetitions, the more likely we can get to thousands of repetitions in a short time. So pacing, or what I sometimes call the dance, the attunement between the adult and the child, works best when we want to create cortical modulation. Shorter or more frequent repetitions are often more powerful. If we can do something 2 or 3 times a day for even 10 or 15 minutes, that's more helpful than if you put all of that time together and did it once a week or even once a day. That's because the low brain responds to the number of episodes rather than the length of time. Low brain seeks routine and predictability, so the more often something happens, the safer the child will feel, and the more likely the low brain is to believe that this is the new normal. It does not understand time, logic, or language. The low brain dislikes novelty because what you don't know could hurt you. Dr. Perry does an awful lot of interviewing with people for the FBI who are so traumatized that FBI has trouble getting them to give meaningful information. What I'm telling you right now is what he has told me that he uses to get them to talk. And he said, I can, in an hour and a half of working with them using these principles, I can normally get them to give the FBI some pretty meaningful information. So the low brain changes best through consistency, meaning routine, repeated, repetitive practice, and things that are rewarding, experiencing things that are desired experiences. And that generally is going to be heavily weighted on social reward. Continuous reinforcement throughout the child's larger environment is incredibly important. So and this is one thing I think that physicians who maybe are not doing the primary treatment want to ask about and to encourage. What are we doing in the child's larger relational environment? Not just the home, not just the kid, but the home, the school, and the community. If we're all on the same page, then we are going to get many, many more positive interactions with a child, and the change will occur much more rapidly. So the idea that a play therapist sees a kid once a week, never talks to the parent, doesn't work with a school, those are not good treatment approaches. And I would strongly encourage you to try to get as much of a collaborative effort as possible. And I know sometimes that's not possible, but please know that that is going to slow down progress. Obviously, we want to watch for spontaneous reoccurrences of prior aberrant behavior that can happen. Bessel van der Kolk and actually has a book to this effect where he talks about the body never forgets. The old circuitry is not gone. And since the new, quote, new normal has been less frequent, it is not unheard of that there will be spontaneous reoccurrences of the old behavior. And I normally caution clients and their families about that, and not to become overly upset about that. It is a process of strengthening the new experiences and the new wiring, and over time they will see much less of the reoccurrence. So relationships, and we've touched on this already, but I just to make sure you understand, it is a major consideration. The human brain is neurologically wired to seek warm, comfort, safe relationships, because it is the primary way that we have survived on this earth. And certainly if you are a child or someone who does not have the skills or the capacity to do everything you need to do to survive, then depending on relationships are going to be incredibly important. So relationships mean that you're safe, that you are in a caring environment, that you belong, and you have protection. The the old mountain men knew this, and one of the things they consistently talked about, a man alone in the wilderness is a dead man. So we are, I guess if any of you remember the old television series Meerkat Manor, and one of the things they often said was that a meerkat alone is a dead meerkat. Well, that's the same with human beings. So the relational quality and milieu has to be a primary focus, especially for traumatized children. Development progresses as a measure more of the relational richness than it does in eliminating negative behavior. The only new learning neural connections that we want to have happen are support for new concepts, thoughts, behaviors, and modulating impulses over prior learning. So we want to increase these in the connection to positive relational outcomes. The child's relational health, which is a relatively new term that the neural trauma people are looking at and using, is really a function of the number of family, teacher, friends, therapists, and community relationships that are rewarding to the child. Some of the early research that Dr. Perry did when he was at Baylor Medical School and was head of psychiatry down there was that they found that seriously emotionally disturbed children had on average 9 healthy relationship experiences a day, and healthy children had 40. And that's a pretty powerful indicator. So the value of relationship may be more important than the reward technique or even the technique at all. In the therapist, client, or patient alliance research, this has been found fairly consistently. Relational attunement synchronizes brain waves, hormones, heart rates, and other bodily systems. So part of the way we learn and part of the way we regulate throughout life is the same way we were regulated by our mothers and our caregivers when we were little. And that is through this state of attunement or a connecting of two minds through the mirror neuron system, we think. And that is critical to change. So the harmonic between people is how we understand, experience empathy, and learn from others. A lot of this material also has great implications for education of children who come from problematic backgrounds in schools. Attunement between adult and child is mandatory for positive change to occur. The child must develop and does develop best and fastest when they're engaged in a healthy relationship where they are attuned. There's a synchronous relationship. And this requires a positive frame of mind towards the child. One of the things I tell our play therapists in training at Wichita State University in the classes I teach is, there is no substitute for the fact you have to like this child. You have to be interested in them. You have to see them as capable of and deserving of love. You have to see the innocence and the woundedness in the child. The inability to connect and form this caring relationship is going to sabotage the ability to help, and it deters organization and development. Recently, there was some of you may have seen this on the news. There was a guy that went in and threw coffee at a barista, a drink at a barista because it wasn't made right. And it had to do with ultimately the man's child had an allergy to peanuts, and what they made had peanuts in it. And this fellow had an otherwise pretty important job, but when it came to his child, the man admitted later and went in and apologized to the lady. He just said, "I lost it." Well, he became so emotional that he descended down in his brain and behaved in a very, very primitive way, so much so that he made national news. We're all capable of that, and we all do best when we are in caring, stabilizing relationships. So brain development, child development, all of that is going to be very, very dependent on our ability to create a sense of attunement in and around this child. Eye-to-eye contact, face-to-face gaze are two of the primary ways that we create this harmonic between us and another person. We believe, as I said earlier, that this is done through the mirror neuron system. We know that 60, 80 beats a minute when people are in a rhythm like that, that it's helpful, which is one of the reasons that when I have attended Native American drum circles, they talk about how the energy flows out of the drum because you have all of these people who are doing things 60 to 80 beats a minute, the dancing, the singing, the beating of the drum, the rattles, all of that stuff. And the energy is felt between everybody. And learning how to do that is a crucial skill for mothers, fathers, therapists, physicians, teachers. Anybody who has to connect to another person needs to be able to create this sense of attunement. The next one is a sense of gratification. So all human beings are going to seek gratification of one kind or another, depending on what they need at that moment. So the thing that has not been well understood, certainly not well understood by the behaviorists, is that what is rewarding has a whole lot to do with the brain region that is mediating the behavior. So human beings are genetically designed to seek safe, supportive, and nurturing relationships. That, as I said, is the greatest predictor of outcome. It's more powerful than material reward. So what is rewarding creates a problem for contingency management programs, as these programs often overemphasize material rewards. The low brain arousal continuum will dictate what is viewed as rewarding and what is not. The most powerful question assessed when we work with traumatized children is the child safe? Because the child is saying, am I safe? And this is a low brain perception, is not necessarily totally conscious. And it's based on sensory stimuli that are coming in. And if the child is sensing stimuli that is similar to stimuli that was experienced when the child was not safe, the child will not feel safe. One of the things that Byron and Carol Norton, who are two very famous authors in play therapy, is they say the first stage of play therapy is that the child is exploring the room, and they have a very elaborate list of behavioral observations that will tell you that, and that the child is trying to determine whether this room where they haven't been and this person they haven't been with is safe. So until the HPA complex is calm and soothed, we are always at risk for going into the fight, flight, freeze, flux, or fawn response, and that is going to be very deleterious to therapeutic and education agenda if we can't get that part of the brain to calm down. And it isn't possible with very traumatized children or adults to get that to calm down quickly. It takes time and experience of safety in a given environment for the person to come to believe that this environment is somehow different than the one that I have been living in. So the perception and evaluation of the environment occurs unconsciously, and it occurs immediately by assessing and comparing the current and environmental stimuli with past experiences. So the gratification of reward will generally move along this continuum. When the child or the adult is perfectly calm, then we can consider those high brain values, beliefs, cognitions, and value-driven behaviors. When we become even slightly aroused autonomically, then we enter a state of alertness where relationships, friends, positive relationships become much more important to us than these values up above. If we continue the arousal and we have a state of alarm, now physical and sensory experiences, salt, fat, sugar, sex, sensory experience that's pleasurable, drugs, all those things, alcohol, those things are often much more powerful. So as we move into fear and we're trying to find a way to escape, then we start running the risk of drug abuse. And finally, abject terror, self-stimulation, dissociated rocking, head banging, self-mutilization. Interestingly enough, most head banging is at heart rate, 60 to 80 beats a minute. So doing for the child what they need in that moment is going to vary based on the child's state of arousal, and getting teachers and parents to understand that I have found to be critically important, and it's often very difficult because one of our underlying beliefs about people is that they can regain control if we put enough pressure on them to do so or command it. And that's that actually can work in the opposite direction at times. So the psychosocial ratio, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to I want to spend a little more time on it. Children require and have different adult to child ratios based on their functional age and development. So as they develop, that changes. The normal sequence is that there is an exclusive single attachment figure. Any of you who have children probably found that the child had a preferred parent, usually the mother, like 99.9% of the time it's the mother, and then secondarily the father. And the little circle down here that I have drawn is if you want to think about that as a primary attachment, and then other people in the child's environment become secondary or tertiary attachment figures. So later we have secondary attachment figures if the primary attachment figure is not available. And then last, extended relationships with multiple attachment figures. So if we move from the center outside, we would have the mother, and then the father, grandparents, close family, friends, teachers, other well-known people in the community. The important thing to remember here, though, is that this order is also the order in which they will back up if the child experiences excessive threat. And traumatized children often have never, they don't necessarily regress, they have never progressed in that sequence. And I've seen cases where kids who are stuck in this primitive kind of thinking are then penalized for that because other people expect them to stop that. One of the things you have to do with this group of kids is you've got to prove to them over time that you are a trusted figure. And if they've never had one, that may take a lot of time. And I often tell our case managers, or did our case managers and attendant care people, that it takes as long as it takes. If you've never had someone that you can trust completely, it's probably going to take a very long time to prove that you're not like everybody that they have been around their whole life. So the defense barriers come down very slowly. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children offers some recommendations about adult to child ratios. Honestly, I regard these as a bit of an overestimate just from the beginning for traumatized children. The most common adult to child ratio that I've seen with traumatized children is 1-to-1, which is the same as a newborn child. When they are struggling or they feel threatened, they will back up and be very infantile in that. The functional age of a child will be much more acute in estimating adult to the child ratio. So pay attention to the functional age at the moment, and that's going to be a much better estimate. In crisis or escalation, Children are likely going to need an attuned caregiver regardless of age, and they will back up in that from being able to function with an age-appropriate group, maybe going back to a single person. And you see this, and we seem to understand it when we have national disasters, and because the trauma is right there and immediate. But when kids have grown up in in deplorable environments that have created an environmental disaster in their whole life, we seem to have more trouble understanding why kids shouldn't just immediately trust. So the typical suggestion is from 1 to 2 years, 1 adult to 3 children. That's way too high when these kids are agitated, and you need to build in a safety valve so that these kids can spend time with a trusted caregiver when they become agitated. So again, showing the same thing I've shown you before, but just so you can look at those adult to child ratios, when everything is going quite well, the adult to child ratio may be 1 to 8 for teens or kids, maybe even larger. When we are becoming more limbic, 1 to 4. When we are moving down into the survival range, 1 to 1, maybe 1 to 3, but I think you're probably going to get closer and closer 1 to 1. Certainly by the time you are having a lot of brainstem or diencephalon kinds of behaviors where we have cardiovascular escalation, attention focusing, that happens where people zero in on a particular thing for their focus of attention, which often for kids is hand movements. And when the teacher is at the front of the room and the traumatized kid is getting escalated for whatever reason, the child's watching the hand movement, not what the teacher said. Consequently, they don't learn. And getting the people who are in charge of the children to understand this process. And it doesn't have to be, for example, the teacher's fault. The kid may be doing it for other reasons, but if we fail to recognize it, we're not going to be helpful to the kids. 9, honoring and respecting others, being respectful. With all of the things that are going on today in the news and around the country about racial injustice and all of that stuff, this becomes increasingly important. And it has always been there, but we have not always paid attention to it. And this is an abbreviated quote from Dr. Perry: all people at all times have dealt with the same threats and problems and have often found workable solutions that have been inculcated into their cultural practices. Honoring and respecting others is pivotal. And to honor an individual is to honor their culture and their family. And one of the things that I've found is that these cultural and ethnic and religious, whatever these rituals are, they're often heavily identified with relationships and patterned neural systems that are already in place for the child's family. So cultural and family rituals are often methods of neural programming, and if we can take advantage of those, we can often help the child recognize existing rituals and systems of beliefs and traditions that contain constructive coping elements, very common to other groups. A simple example of that is I have a couple of, and this is the Western term. I can't pronounce the actual name of the indigenous people to the Yucatan Peninsula in in Mexico. But they have nightmare dolls, and by the parent talking to the child about their nightmares and creating a graphic depiction, which inculcates their traditional beliefs that the physical world and the spiritual world are both real. They're just different. You can take something from the spiritual world and make it concrete, which you can now manipulate. And when parents do that with their children, they have a very, very high rate of success of the nightmare stopping. I don't think that's a lot different than a lot of play therapy activities. So if we can see the value in cultural practice and rituals, we may be able to work through those and not have to create new ones. And the other ones are probably already inculcated. I've had several Native Americans who were in Western European therapy who told me that they went down to generally in the this part of the country down to Oklahoma to some of the reservations and participated in cultural healing rituals, and that they found those more helpful than the talk therapy. I think they're right. So be very sensitive to that. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel if something that is useful already exists. The last thing we're going to talk about today are implicit and explicit memories. Most of the brain is wired for implicit memory, not memories that we can pull up to conscious memory and verbalize. And the implicit memory they're primarily located in the low brain, and they don't respond to language, logic, reason, a sense of time, or self-awareness. And these experiences are automatically triggered, as we've talked about already. Even novel stimuli will be perceived often as negative or threatening because what you don't understand can hurt you. So the low brain produces affects associated with the immediate experience. Low brain pathways do not have inhibitory capacities. That's in the cortex. The cortex is capable of dampening and mediating these a little bit, but not eliminating them. And because the low brain is generating these as part of their survival drive. So the cortex often acts in the service of the low brain impulses, finding acceptable methods of expressing. And I put over here in parentheses, think ego. In fact, if you want to, if you're curious, if you will go to the internet and Google id, ego, and superego, and brain imaging, there are neuroscientists who will show you where those Freudian analytical places are in the brain. One of the things I think that neuroscience is doing is helping us give scientific explanations to things that very, very smart people thought about and theorized long ago. Did they have it all right? Not always, but much of what they talk about has been in many cases verified by scientific neurological investigation of the brain. So the primary drives of the low brain are seeking, expectancy, caring, nurturing, social play. We've talked about those. And the low brain is going to try to find a way to get those to be expressed. And then the cortex is going to try to do that in as healthy a fashion as we can. So, and I've already said this, I said it earlier because I didn't know we were going to get to it, but Piaget research offers little or no support for teaching regulatory control over impulses in young children due to the immaturity of the cortex. A very wise psychologist early in my professional career talked about child management being largely a method of controlling and managing children until the brain matured. And I think there is definitely some truth to that. So this immaturity, and if you Google Piaget and the brain, as I think I mentioned earlier, you can see the areas of the brain that are immature, and it's the same areas of the brain that control the more mature behavior, but you can tell it just isn't as well connected and wired because it just does not function as well. So that contributes to the errors in judgment, the impulse control problems, the outbursts, the behavioral problems, the lack of critical thinking, the lack of problem solving. Children, and we want to make sure people understand when I say children, the brain is not technically completely mature until the mid to late 20s, and most of the parts that we need to be in place late teens. Empathy, for example, is not completely in place until the late teens. That all depends on brain development. And we know that kids that are traumatized and kids that come from deprived backgrounds have much more trouble reaching these developmental milestones. So even Piagetian concepts are very brain development dependent. Last, just to talk a little bit about dosing. I said 10. There's 11 because we've talked about a lot of the structural things, but now dosing. How often do you have to do it? And I've already alluded to some of this. Each brain region is very focused on a different level, and they change over time. The upper brain, because it learns very, very rapidly, sometimes you can have very few repetitions. EMDR is a classic example of that, and I'm quoting Dr. Perry here. If EMDR is used with individuals who have a history of intact neural wiring, then some of the stories about single episode cures is possible, because what the EMDR does is stimulate the old circuitry. But EMDR does not work as well, according to the neuroscientists that I've talked with, when the healthy pre-circuitry is not present. So EMDR is a very, very helpful technique for people who have intact neural circuitry based on healthy development, but is a little less helpful if there isn't. And one of my colleagues who is currently in the process of being certified for EMDR has said that the people who are doing the certification process are beginning to talk about this kind of thing, and they are beginning to work some of these principles into the training, which I think is encouraging. So the idea that neuroscience can take the good things that we know and make them better certainly seems to be true, and I guess that's the message I hope people get. The low brain, however, learns very rapidly early in life, not so well later. We know that parts of the brain that aren't conscious learn and change later in life much more slowly, and can take as many as 30 to 40,000 rehearsals. Now, those kinds of numbers are possible if we have the child's entire community, family, school, church, whoever, if we have everybody on board doing the same kinds of things, we can get those kinds of numbers without fail. So modalities are brain specific. Treatment must begin at the lower, most disorganized. We've talked about that a number of times, but I would offer one thing here is, and I was told this by a physician, that stroke victims who have difficulty in maybe math skills or language or whatever, you don't do remedial work on those things. First, you start with making sure that their motor systems are intact. And one of the things Dr. Perry told me one time was that when you do that, sometimes you'll see skills come back that don't need to be remediated at all because you did that bottom-up kind of approach. So I just throw that out there. Oh, this also is the logic, the bottom up in Dr. Perry's NMT or neural sequential model of therapeutics is that we begin with regulating, we move to relating, and we end up with reason. And that is going through the kind of bottom up sequence. If you look at the ARC model, which came out of the Harvard Medical School, they're doing a very similar thing, have a little different language for it, but it's a very similar model and a very useful one. The Kinnenbaugh that I gave you the reference for is, and Spinoza are prolific writers about the ARC model. Last, and we're ending just about on time. I actually managed to get this done a little faster than I thought I could. For your own professional growth, one of the things that I would suggest, if you're interested in this, is you can go to the Child Trauma Academy's website, and you can get into their library, which many articles in there are downloadable for free. And it's a way of continuing to grow and develop your skills based on the emerging neuroscience. Trauma sensitive schools, a whole school approach in Massachusetts. They have, if you'll go to that, they have 2 books that are downloadable for free. I would encourage you to continue to seek trauma responsive training, supervision and mentoring where you can find it. Start a book study. Some of the ones we've used at our center, I retired in November, so maybe they changed everything since then. I don't think so, but Dr. Perry's book, Born to Love, or The Boy Raised as a Dog, or his most recent one with Oprah, What Happened to You, those seem to be really good mediums for the lay public to understand these, as well as professionals. The trauma sensitive schools books, which I talked about up above, there's part 1 and part 2. Those are both downloadable. Trying to get system-wide education about these ideas and ongoing discussion, I think, within systems is really important. I would encourage any of you who are really interested in it, if nothing else, develop a peer support discussion group network where we can talk about these things, share what you're learning, share what you've read with others. And with that, I will tell you that I am content to be done, and we'll stay on and answer questions for a while if any of you are interested in that. So I will turn this back over to to the
All right.
cave. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, I got a couple comments in my chat box over the presentation.
Okay.
One of the comments was that cortex and subcortical areas undergo massive pruning during puberty, and it seems like it would be an ideal time to influence what is reserved and to help shape the final higher brain structure. Do you think that tools such as psilocybin which have reported to allow the setting of the connectomes in the brain to be helpful for this?
I can't answer that. I don't know. I think that is a very logical thought. And I don't know whether there's a lot of research on that or not. One thing I can tell you, the pruning makes things more efficient for sure, but it probably is a really helpful practice to have created good neural networks before the pruning, because the pruning is only going to be based on the networks that are there. But and quite honestly, I hadn't even thought of that, but that might be a brilliant study for some of the folks at the KU Med Center to embark on. I think that would be extraordinarily helpful. Yeah. Just the sort of thing we want to see going long term. There's more we don't know than we do know, I think, at this point.
Any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I know some people have patients at 1, and there'll be the brief after session with Dr. Gaskill for the residents.
I had a question that child rearing has likely changed dramatically over the last 100 to 200 years.
Oh, yes.
So we moved to a situation where people were raised and died within 50 years of where they were born.
Yep.
They were raised in nuclear families or slightly more on farms, remote from everyone else. Mm-hmm. So perhaps your mother's approach was appropriate for that era of time. And maybe what's happened is we haven't adjusted our era as much as we've adjusted our socialization.
I think that is an excellent thought. And I think my suggestion on study groups or discussion groups, I think we need to be taking all of that stuff apart. As a matter of fact, at WSU, when I teach the 2 classes on play therapy, we spend a fair amount of time talking about exactly what you have just brought up, and that the world is dramatically different than it was. And those undoubtedly have an impact on us that we need to take into account. So yeah, you're thinking along the same lines that I have thought about a lot of that. And my mother was clearly a product of her parents, and they were originally very rural people and homesteaders down in Edwards County, and the homestead was 12 miles from Kinsley. And in horse and buggy days, 12 miles would have been at 3-4 miles an hour, several hours to get to town. So yeah. And I guess just to conclude what you're talking about, I do think that we need to do a lot of reflecting on the cultural changes in society, and examine and re-examine a lot of our thoughts that maybe made more sense at one time. You know, and one of the things I often talk to the students about, which it's interesting that they really have never, most of them never thought about this. I said, why in the human species is the male larger and capable of more violence typically? Well, if you live in a hunter-gatherer society, it may be imperative that you not put the females who are giving birth to the babies at risk in either hunting, gathering, or fending off another group of people. And I suggest to them, or something to think about, that males in a primitive environment may be more expendable.
Exactly.
And I think we need to talk about some of those things, because we bring these traditions with us, not knowing even where they came from, or maybe why they maybe made sense once, and do they make sense now? You know, a female in a bunker at McConnell Air Force Base is just as capable of delivering a drone to some place in the world as a man. So so the rules change.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, well, thank you. I love talking about this. If you want to email me, we can have dialogue. I just want people out there thinking about this, and I want them to understand that neuroscience is not threatening our sacred cows in play therapy or therapy. It doesn't say that Freud or or Fritz Perls or any of these people didn't know what they were talking about. In fact, what it has done for me is convinced me that all of these people in their own ways were brilliant, and they saw things that most everybody else didn't say or see. We now are in a position to validate a lot of things they have said and improve on them. Matter of fact, I think I mentioned this. I didn't mention his name, J.P. Lilly, who's one of the foremost authorities on Jungian play therapy in the United States, if not the world. He and I gave a presentation at the last international conference, and it was the neurobiology of Jungian theory, and which I figured we wouldn't have a lot of people attend. We had a little less than 50 people come, but they found it fascinating because there's so much science behind the things that Carl Jung theorized, that this man sitting in his office, he understood a lot of things that are very brain-based, but he didn't have an fMRI to explore them. And now we do. So I think psychiatry and mental health, generally speaking, is ready for and on the verge of a brand new, exciting era. I hope.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and terminate now. And thanks everybody for coming. And otherwise, KU residents, if you could remain on for a brief conversation afterwards with Dr. Gaskill.
Well, thank you for letting me come and talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It is interesting watching the screen just kind of keep shrinking.
Yeah. I think we had like 70 or so people today. It was a good crowd. So.
Oh, well, that's good. Good.
Well, and that's how many were logged onto Zoom. I know some of them are working in the same room, so they'll pull it up on a big screen. So
Okay.
there's probably a few more. Do you happen to know Dr. Glenn Veenstra?